Hello, my name is Mike Talty and I work at Microsoft in the UK. This is one of a number of short videos about a new technology that's coming with Visual Studio, codename Orcus. Orcus will be the next version of Visual Studio that follows on from 2005. And the new technology we're talking about here is Language Integrated Query, or Linq, to SQL. And what that really is the new Language Integrated Query pattern that crops up in various places in Visual Studio Orcus, put on top of a new data access API that provides object relational mapping that allows you to pull records from your database tables straight into memory as objects. Now, as I say, this is one of a number of sessions, so if you haven't seen perhaps the introductory sessions and so on, it might be worth going and checking some of those out before you jump into the middle of this session. Here we're just going to take literally a couple of minutes talking about how you can wrap transactions around the work that you're doing with Linq to SQL. Okay, in this session I'm working with the March technology preview of Visual Studio codename Orcus, which was the latest publicly available build at the time of recording the video. What I've got here in this session is a simple console application. It's very similar to applications we've used in other sessions. Into that simple application we've put a Linq to SQL diagram. It only has the customer entity on it right now from the Northwind database, and we've also got a single code file which right now just creates a data context to that Northwind database and then doesn't do anything else just yet. In terms of transactions, let's write some code that we can play with. We'll create a new customer. So we've got one of those. We'll set the customer ID. In fact, let's just set the customer ID to be demo X. And for Northwind, you also have to set the company name to be X company, for instance. That should do for us right there. So we've got this new customer. We can add it to the context, so context.customers.add, that marks it as a new record, and then we call context.submitChanges, and that will send that record into the database. If we then wanted to create another new customer, so we have C equals new customer again, customer ID, demo Y, company name equals Y company, and we can walk back to the customers table and add that other new customer, and then we can do context.submitChanges. Now if we wanted to bundle some of this work within the bounds of a single transaction, maybe we want these two inserts to be part of a single transaction, then what we can do is what we'd expect to do with standard .NET programming when we got to version 2.0 of the framework. We can use system.transactions. So if we want this stuff to be transactional, we can wrap a transaction scope around it. You can create that thing however you want to create it, with different levels of isolation and so on. And at the end of the scope, like we normally would do, is we can mark that scope as complete, and we're essentially wrapping the transaction around these operations. It's important to realize we could also put queries from the context inside the bounds of that transaction scope, and they would also then be included as part of the transactional work. So we can do that, and that'll build and do the right thing. I want to say that if you didn't have a transaction scope around these two calls to submit changes, then each one of the calls to submit changes would create its own implicit transaction for the work that it was doing. So if we didn't have this scope here, what you would get is transaction 1 and transaction 2. Because we have the scope, we're just using one transaction for the whole of the code that you see within the yellow there on the screen. We can use transaction scopes, which is probably what you'd expect to see from .NET Framework 2, and the data context will pick that stuff up. The alternative might be that you're writing a piece of code where you already have a transaction from, say, ADO.NET, and you don't want to begin another scope like this. In that case, what you can do, let's take away that transaction scope and just reformat the code. In that case, what you can do, let's imagine that we get an IDB transaction from somewhere. Let's just go and resolve that namespace. We'll call it my transaction. I'm going to leave it as null because I don't have anywhere to get it from, but imagine that you did. Then what we can do is go to the context and set its transaction to equal the transaction we've got. And we go and build that code. Oh, excuse me, we've still got a scope in there. Let's just get rid of that. And we can go and build that code and it would do the right thing for us. So we really get those two choices. You can use a transaction scope and wrap it around the various interactions that you're performing on a context. It's important to realize you can always walk up to the context and find its transaction after you've set it. Or You can leave the context to use its own transaction at the point where you submit changes. It'll just use its own transaction for that operation or those operations. Or you can use a transaction scope and wrap it around the operations that you want. So really those three choices. Let the context work it out, bring your own in a transaction scope, or bring your own by setting the transaction property on the context. Just a quick summary on what is a very short video. When we're dealing with transactions and the data context, we can either call context.submitChanges, and the data context will create its own transaction for the operations it's performing in order to do your inserts, updates and deletes. We can wrap a transaction scope around the data context operations that we want included in that transaction. And that would also include the queries that we are performing to the database. So if you wanted to do some serializable work, for instance, you could wrap a transaction scope around all the operations that you wanted to be serializable. Or if you don't want to use transaction scopes, you've already got a database transaction from somewhere else, the data context class has that transaction property that you can set on it, which again is going to mean that when you're performing operations, they will fall within the bounds of that transaction that you have explicitly set on the data context. Now, where can you go if you want to get some more information on Linq? There's a center up on MSDN, the URL is there on the screen, that will provide you information on the Linq project, including Linq to SQL. There's some great blogs up at linqinaction.net. I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that if you like reading RSS and blogs. And finally, if you want to provide some feedback on the specific things you saw in this session, feel free to mail me. My email address is just there on the screen, so you can mail me and I'll try and answer your questions on the session. Other than that, thanks very much for taking the time to listen, and I hope to catch you again in the future.